Today I want to continue with part 2 of our second topic in the book of James, which I've titled How to Overcome Our Self-Defeating Behaviors. You see, one of the things that happens when we're under stress is we start looking for coping strategies to ease our anxiety. But unfortunately, those things often make it worse for us because the coping strategies we choose can often be very unhealthy. And James has a lot to say about these distractions, these disturbances or temptations in our lives. And he gives us really some wise advice on how to not be tempted by our typical self-defeating behaviors that we tend to go to in times of stress, our bad habits, the things we often do to comfort ourselves, to self-soothe ourselves when we're anxious or we're fearful or we're worried. So today we're going to continue looking at how to counter our bad habits. And I hope it's going to be very practical in helping us deal with the self-defeating behaviors in our lives. So I want to begin by reading what James has to say about temptation. He says in chapter 1, verses 13 through 16, "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me.' For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters." Now, there's a lot of information on temptation that we're going to look at in this passage. And we're going to continue looking at these 9 counter moves to keep us on track so that we don't fall into the same typical traps or self-defeating behaviors when we get under stress. Number 1, and which we looked at a couple of weeks ago, but I do want to just review it briefly. Number 1, I need to know my default coping strategy if I'm going to successfully counter self-defeating behaviors in my life. In other words, you need to know and recognize what's the typical way that you stumble. So as an individual, I need to know my default coping strategy. You see, each of us need to understand this because we tend to fall into a certain sin or temptation over and over and over again in our lives. And we keep saying to ourselves, why do I do that? Why do I keep falling into that? Why did I do that? And when that happens in our lives, that's the persistent sin. That's the distraction. That's our default coping mechanism or strategy. And all these self-defeating behaviors may continue to increase if we don't know how to deal with this. So I first need to know my predictable area of failure, where I tend to fall. What's my default coping device? Second, and we also looked at this a couple of weeks ago, I need to know my emotional triggers if I'm going to successfully counter self-defeating behaviors in my life. If you're going to overcome the things that keep causing you to stumble, you need to know the emotional triggers that set you off. Those are the things that make you vulnerable to your particular temptation. Now, I want you to listen to this closely. A key to defeating temptation is this: don't focus on behavior that you don't like. Don't focus on behavior that you don't like. In other words, don't focus on the actions, on your activity, on your behavior. Instead, focus on what you're feeling and what you're thinking that's causing those actions. You see, every action in your life is caused by an emotion. And every emotion is caused by a thought. So if you want to change the way you act, you've got to change the way you feel. If you want to change the way you feel, then you've got to change the way you think, because it all starts in your brain. Now understand this: Satan plays on your emotions. And of course, advertisers know all about this. They play on your emotions as well. They know what will manipulate you, what will trigger you. And Satan loves to hook your feelings. He's a master manipulator of your moods. And by the way, do you know what's the most common foothold Satan uses in your life to get your attention? Negative emotions. Negative emotions give Satan a foothold in our life. And you and I are far more vulnerable to temptation when we're in certain emotional moods or states. And you're far less vulnerable to temptation when you're in other emotional states. And so we need to understand that these differ from person to person. Because why? We're all different, aren't we? So I first need to know my default coping strategy. Where do I tend to stumble when I'm under stress? And then secondly, I need to know my emotional triggers. Why do I tend to stumble, and what causes me to be triggered? Now here's the third thing that we need to know, and I want to pick up today with number 3. Third, I need to learn my patterns if I'm going to successfully counter self-defeating behaviors in my life. I need to learn my patterns. What kind of patterns? Your patterns of temptation. My patterns of temptation. You see, each of us have a unique pattern of temptation, just like you have a unique fingerprint. You have a unique voice print. You have a unique, heartbeat. You have a unique eye print. You see, we are all unique in many, many different ways of our lives. For example, no two snowflakes are alike. No two human beings are alike. Even identical twins are different. And you also have a unique susceptibility to certain temptations that don't bother other people. They bother you, but they don't bother others. Your spouse maybe isn't bothered by that, but you are. There's certain situations that tempt you and others that don't. And Satan knows exactly what your pattern is. So you better know and understand your pattern as well. Now, if you can identify your pattern of temptation, then you can protect yourself from those problems in advance. And you can avoid those situations. But you need to know, what is it that tempts me? You need to know, why am I tempted? And you need to know when and where and all of the other details. Proverbs chapter 14 verse 8 says this: the wise man looks ahead. The fool tries to fool himself, and he won't face the facts. You see, we need to look ahead so that we know when temptations are coming. Because foolish people don't do that, and instead they rationalize. And that means they tell rational lies to themselves. That means they try to justify with their mind what they know in their heart is wrong. But you see, mature people are self-aware of what their patterns are, the dangers. Now, let me give you 5 questions to ask yourself about your particular patterns in your own life. The first question to ask yourself is this: when am I most tempted? When am I most tempted? Ask yourself that question. When am I most tempted? And then do a little self-evaluation. Which day of the week? Am I more tempted on a Friday? Or am I more tempted on a Monday or Saturday or Sunday? What time of the day? Am I tempted more in the morning, or am I tempted more at lunch or early evening or late evening or after everyone else is in bed? When am I most tempted? You see, the fact is we're tempted at different times of the day. Why? Because we're all unique. Number 2, ask yourself this question: where? Where am I most tempted? Am I most tempted at work? Am I most tempted in the kitchen? Am I most tempted sitting in front of the computer? Am I more tempted in front of the TV? For example, you can be tempted at your neighbor's house. You could be tempted at a 7-Eleven store or at a sports bar. You could be tempted at a beach. It doesn't matter. You just need to know where you're most tempted, where you're most vulnerable. And my advice to you is this: if that's a problem for you, avoid those places. If you don't want to get stung, stay away from the bees, right? You don't go to the bar to eat pretzels if you have a difficult time controlling your drinking. So when am I most tempted? Where am I most tempted? And number 3, you want to ask yourself the question: who is with me when I'm most tempted? Who's with me when I'm most tempted? Now, this is an important question. Are you most tempted when you're alone? Or are you most tempted when you're isolated at home by yourself? Are you most tempted when you're with a group of friends or with coworkers? Are you most tempted when you're with a crowd of strangers? Are you most tempted, for example, to get angry when you're with your family? You see, you need to know, who am I around? You need to know these things. Number 4, you'll want to ask the question: what temporary benefit do I get when I give in to temptation? What temporary benefit do I get when I give in to temptation? When I give in to anger, when I give in to food, when I give in to pornography, when I give in to controlling, when I give in to fear, when I give in to worry, or what do I get when I give in to drinking? When I give in to, and you fill in the blank, whatever it is. Do I get more comfort? Do I get more relief? Does it bring me excitement? Does it bring me false confidence? The Bible says in Hebrews 11, verse 25, there's pleasure in sin. And let me just say to you, if sin wasn't pleasurable, nobody'd be doing it. You see, if sin was painful, nobody'd do it. So what's the payoff? What is the payoff when I do this self-defeating behavior and I give in to my temptation? And then number 5, you need to ask yourself the question: how do I feel right before I'm tempted? How do I feel in that moment or moments right before I'm tempted? Am I most tempted when I get frustrated? When I'm scared? When I'm worried? When I'm bored? When I'm angry? Or when I'm lonely? Am I most tempted when I can't sleep? You see, it's very important to know your emotional triggers. What makes you vulnerable? Now, once you know your answers to these questions, that leads me to the 4th countermeasure that we need to take. In other words, once we identify these answers to these 5 questions, then we need to take actions to steer clear of all of that in our lives. And so number 4, I must plan to avoid those situations if I'm going to successfully counter self-defeating behaviors in my life. I must plan to avoid getting myself in those situations that will trigger me. Proverbs chapter 4, verses 26 and 27 says, "Plan carefully what you do. Avoid evil and walk straight ahead. Don't go one step off to the right, off the right way." In other words, if I know in that situation, whatever it is, I'm going to be tempted to get angry, to exaggerate, to lie, to control, to be resentful, to be jealous, to be envious, whatever it is. If I know in those situations all these negative emotions are going to come out, well, it's a pretty good idea to avoid them if possible. If you're trying to diet, for example, you don't go and sit and do your homework in an ice cream parlor or whatever tends to make you want to eat, right? Instead, you carry healthy snacks with you. That's planning in advance. For example, if you're going to the country fair, or rather the county fair like this summer, and you're going to eat fried everything, well, you know that's going to kill your diet, right? So instead, you need to plan in advance and be prepared to avoid eating those foods. Or if you struggle with controlling alcohol, you don't go to a bar to watch the game, right? Maybe you avoid certain stores or establishments. Maybe you need to block some channels on your TV, internet, or even on your smartphone. Now, sometimes you're going to get hit out of the blue despite the best laid plans to avoid those situations. I mean, you do your best to plan to avoid the temptation, right? You don't want to put yourself in that situation. But sometimes you're in an emergency situation and you get hit out of the blue with that temptation. And that's when you need emergency tactics to help you keep from falling to your default self-defeating behavior. You see, that's the next thing. You ask God for help. That's the next step. And so number 5, I need to ask God for help if I'm going to successfully counter self-defeating behaviors in my life. You see, He's willing, He's waiting, and He's wanting to help you, but you've got to ask. Now, sometimes you just have to pray a microwave prayer. It's not a long conversation. And so you say, well, what's a microwave prayer? Well, it's one word: help. Help. Mayday. SOS. God, I need help right now. Now, the Bible, by the way, is literally full of examples of people like David and Daniel and Peter and Paul who prayed those microwave kind of prayers. One-way prayers. God, I need help right now. I'm being tempted. Psalm 50 verse 15 says, "Call to me when trouble comes, and I will save you." Call to me, God says. And that call is sometimes literally a one-word cry. It's a cry for help. Help, God, I need help. That's an emergency tactic. Yeah, you need to plan to avoid temptational situations, but sometimes it comes out of left field. Now, why can I expect God to help me? Why? Because He's sympathetic to your situation. Listen to Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15 and 16, where Jesus says that He understands our weakness. Jesus says He understands our weakness in those verses. That means our default negative behavior, our default way of coping with stress. He understands our weaknesses because He faced the same temptations we do while He was here on earth. Did you know that Jesus was tempted in all things, in all points, the Bible says, like you and I, just as we are, and yet it says He did not sin? Was Jesus ever tempted to be discouraged? Yes, He was. Was Jesus ever tempted to be prideful? Yes. Was Jesus ever tempted to retaliate? Well, yes. Was Jesus ever tempted sexually? Yes. And the Bible says that we come to Him because He knows how to overcome it. He faced the same temptation or temptations we do, and yet He did not give in. He did not succumb. He did not sin. He did not give in to the temptation to sin. And so it says, because Jesus has been successful at overcoming the default behaviors of our humanity, he says, let us come boldly to our gracious God, and there we will receive his mercy and grace to help us when we need it. Did Jesus ever struggle with loneliness? Yes. Did he ever struggle with fatigue? Yes. Well, what about anger? Did Jesus ever struggle with that? Yeah, the answer is yes. He was God, but he was fully in a human body. But he never sinned. He had the same kind of temptations we do. He experienced the same vulnerabilities, but he never sinned. He is truly the sinless Son of God, and we can go to him for help because he's been there and done that, and he understands what we're going through when we're facing these temptations and these vulnerabilities in our lives. When we're facing the temptation to commit over and over again these self-defeating behaviors, Jesus says, come to me. I understand. I will give you strength, and I will give you the victory over sin. Well, join me next week as we continue this journey of learning how to overcome these self-defeating behaviors in our lives.